I'm not in my general preaching attire this evening. It's all buried at the bottom of a suitcase somewhere. So, and actually most of it just got thrown away. So we have whittled all of our things down to a couple suitcases, and that's all we got left. So I think it's been a healthy process, though. I did want to give an update on the coat drive just before we begin the lesson this evening. We had initially 175 coats that were given. Thank you for giving those. And there were originally 100 that went the first Saturday that we did it. So it was the 23rd of November. There was 100 that went. And then we put them out the next this Friday, and about, I think, 40 or 50 more went out. So we had quite a few people who came by, and so the response was pretty good, and it's always good to communicate to the community that we care about them, especially those who are in need. The elders asked me to give a quick update on just what I was going to be doing in Guam and where Guam is and what's going on in Guam. And I've had several people ask me, several people have thought Guam's in a continent that it's not in, or it's, they don't know where it is, and so they've asked me about it. And so I wanted to share a little bit of that information tonight. I wanted to say before that I want to thank this congregation for so many things. There's too many things to mention, too many people to mention. The hard part about this has not been getting rid of our things. I've been ready to throw stuff away for months, weeks. And the hardest part and part that almost breaks our hearts is leaving this congregation. Out of all the things that want to hold us back, I think it's the affection that we have for the people here that is the hardest, especially this bunch up here, even though we harass all of them all the time. But just thank you for everything. The people have supported us in a number of different ways, the prayers that have come our way, so many things to be thankful for on this Thanksgiving for this congregation. So with that, let me jump into a quick Guam presentation. It's going to take probably no more than 10 minutes to get through it, and then a quick lesson, and then we will close out. And so let me make sure we've got this going. So where is Guam? That's really the first question, the question I think I get asked the most. Where is it, and where are you guys going? And so I might jump around here. So if you see here, it's a little blown out, but this is the United States. And so Costa Rica, where our bunches go, is down around this area. There's Nicaragua. Costa Rica is south of that. And then Peru is where we went on our medical campaign in February, Megan and myself. And so here's Hawaii. I believe it's right there. And so we're headed to the east. Oh, yeah, there, thank you, the west. I should know where I'm going. I'm pressing the button backwards or wrong too. So here we are. This is now the United States. We're moving to the west, and here is Hawaii. And then you're looking over here, the Philippines, Indonesia, Australia's down here, Japan, and then China is over in this area. So continue moving to the west, and you get to Hawaii is now over here. This is China, obviously, Japan. The Philippines, Isaac is over here somewhere. And the easiest way to find Guam is to line up Japan and the Philippines and kind of make a 90-degree angle between those two and do a zoom in with your Google Maps. And so here we are, we're zooming in a little bit. And there it is. So the resolution's not great on the projector, but we've got Guam here. The North Mariana Islands are here. So the Philippines, where both Megan and I have been, and where Dale Byram works is over here. And so it's about a 4-hour flight between these two locations. And we were hoping maybe to get over there and help Dale with some of his work. New Zealand, where Trevor has been, is down over here. But zoom in a little bit further. Let's see, where did we go? Oh, I went backwards. So Guam, North Mariana Islands, I believe this is pronounced Palau or Palu. There's a missionary who we have become acquainted with named Joey Treat who works there. And starting to get a little bit bigger here. I think the easiest way to think about Guam is just kind of looks like California backwards. And about 30 miles, a little bit more than 30 miles from tip to tip, and so it's not a huge place, but the capital is this city right here. It's called Hagana. I believe the T is silent there, but we're going to initially land up here in Tamuning, and then we will take a rental car probably down here to right about the middle, and that's where we're going to be based the first week as we try to fund an apartment and get everything sorted out. And so there are two churches. I'm going to get a neck cramp. There are two churches here. There's one up here in the top around Higo, which is around Anderson Air Force Base, and that's called the North Guam Church of Christ. There's a missionary there named Wade Phillips, and he works with Dale, who's in the Philippines, and there's a relationship there, and so we got connected with them. There's also in this place called Asan, another congregation where more of a local place, where the church in the north is primarily military based, and then the one here in the middle is more of the locals who attend there. So just an interesting fact here, when you zoom out a little bit, and Guam is right here, it's not on the map, but this is just a topographical or however you want to say it, fancy word, for shows the hills and the valleys and things like that. And this Guam sits here, and this black streak here is the Mariana Trench. I didn't realize this until yesterday when I was looking this up. But the Mariana Trench is the deepest place in all the ocean, and right here is a place called Challenger Deep, and that's the deepest point in all of the ocean, which is 7 miles. So Dad's always talking to me about, sharks coming up and eating you if you go into the ocean. Who knows what's going to swim up from there to scare some people. Some creepy things live down there. So anyway, just some quick facts about Guam here. The official language is English. It is a U.S. territory, so their money is the U.S. dollar. All their street signs are in English, which is a good thing for us. And there's also the Chamorro people. The Chamorro people are the native Pacific Islanders who have inhabited the island for a couple thousand years. Population, about 163,000. And ethnic group-wise, I think this excludes the military. But ethnic groups are 37% of those are the Chamorros, and there's a lot of Filipinos that are over there as well, both I think for work and people that have relocated over there, about 25%, and then from there it drops down quite drastically. I think the Chukasi is a Pacific Island group, and then there's Chinese and Japanese. Religion, 75% Roman Catholic, 17.7% Protestant, and the whole area is about 210 square miles, so not a huge place. And they do drive on the right side of the road, which is going to be really helpful when we get over there. It was first located by, the first European to find it was Ferdinand Magellan. We probably know that name, in 1521. The island was colonized by the Spanish a little bit later on until about 1898, so 120 years ago. And they actually greet each other in a lot of Spanish greetings like Buenos Dias, Buenas noches, like you would hear in Costa Rica, and that's the reason why. And following the defeat of the Spanish in the Spanish and American War, the island was handed over to the United States as part of the Treaty of Paris, and so that's how it became a U.S. territory, and that was in 1898. It has a lot of significance in World War II. The island was attacked by the Japanese, I think the day after Pearl Harbor, and they occupied the island for 2.5 years, and they put a lot of hardship on the local people there. They put them in internment camps and had forced labor and a bunch of other things. They did not care for them, and 2.5 years later in the Battle of Guam, the United States came and took it back, and it's, as I mentioned earlier, currently home to Anderson Air Force Base, and there's also a naval base there. So just a really brief summary of what we're going to be doing there. We've seen several mission works, and have looked at a lot of different models for how mission work has been done. And we've seen some people who work in teams, some people who work individually, some people who support themselves, some people who raise support in the traditional way. And there are pros and cons to all of those. And so what we've really kind of narrowed in on is that we want to be self-supporting and be able to work and raise our money. And so Megan's going to be working over there as a nurse, and I'm going to be working over there on some projects that we've already started to make our money in the future to be self-supporting. So that's our goal, and we would appreciate it if you would pray to that end. And we want to engage with that local congregation. I guess there's some division between the church in the north and the church in the middle. And one of the goals of Wade Phillips, who's stationed over there, or is looking to be stationed over there, is to bring those two churches back together because of and reconcile that divide. And so maybe we can have some influence towards that end. And so we'd appreciate your prayers for that as well. And just prayers for safety tomorrow. We'll leave about 7:20 from Columbus and fly to Denver, and then to Honolulu, and then to Guam. All in all, it's about 20 hours in the air. But, both Megan and I dislike flying, but at least it's only one way this time versus going to India or the Philippines where you got to turn around and do it again in a week or two. So I appreciate your prayers and all of your support in every way, and I just want to say thank you again to this congregation for so much. And so let's get into the lesson. The lesson will tie in a little bit here, and I do want to reference one of these slides a little bit later on, and so we'll kind of hop back here. If you still have your Bibles open, leave them to Genesis chapter 8. And there was a phrase, the very beginning of Genesis chapter 8, that caught my attention when I first read it. And it was the first 4 words of that chapter. But God remembered Noah. I thought that was interesting because it's almost as if God could have forgotten him. And why does it say here that he remembers him? Almost as if he came back to mind after God was done accomplishing something else, or had put his mind towards something else and is now returning to Noah. Why does it say that? Well, the context is in Genesis chapter 7, the flood has just come, right? If you read the end of chapter 7, verse 21, all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures. They were blotted out from the ends of the earth. Only Noah was left and those who were with him in the ark, and the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. And so God has just accomplished this work of judgment on the earth, and the reason that he does that is because the world is wicked. And so he wants to refine this earth that he has created to become what it needs to be, and to ultimately work out his eternal purpose in doing that. And so I thought it was interesting when it says in chapter 8, but God remembered Noah. He's done all of these other things. The world is now covered in water, and God turns his attention back to the boat. And I think it's really an astounding thing in and of itself that God does remember Noah. And, if you've ever been down to the Ark in Kentucky, where they have the full-size replica of the Ark, you're probably thinking, well, how could you forget Noah, right? Because he's on this massive boat. It's taken all this time to build this thing. If you've ever gone there, it's over 4 stories tall. And you just are dwarfed as you continue to walk up. When you enter it, you kind of come in from the bottom and you're just looking up at this massive structure. But the Ark was over 4 stories tall. And according to the Ark Encounters website, there were 3.1 million board feet of timber in the Ark, estimated. And that's enough to stretch from where the Ark sits in northern Kentucky all the way to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, if you lay those boards back to back. You can fit 3 NASA space shuttles, tail to nose, on the roof of the Ark. And it has the same storage capacity as 450 standard semi-trailers and 450 semi-trailers, right? You can fit the equivalent of that on board the Ark. And so we look up at this architectural wonder, and we're just amazed at its size and the time that it took to build it. We think, how could anyone ever forget the Ark? But I think a lot of times we fail to look from God's perspective. And what is so great to us may not be as great to a God who can build worlds in a matter of days. Right? So you think about God's perspective. God doesn't look up at the Ark. God looks down at the Ark. And if you've ever flown over the Atlantic or the Pacific Oceans, or maybe you've taken a boat, that would be even better. You can ride across those oceans, fly across them for hours and hours and hours. And it seems like there's just endless ocean, and it's never going to end. Those plane rides feel like they're never going to end as you're flying over the Pacific. And the world in our story here is completely covered with that water, and so there's no dry land at all. And if you do a rough estimate of the measurements of the ark, you can figure out what the footprint of the ark would have been in square feet. So we know that if you take a cubit and you say that's 1.5 feet, that's kind of the general estimate for what a cubit is. 1.5 feet. And the Bible gives us the dimensions of the ark. There were 300 cubits long. So 450 feet, roughly. It was 50 cubits wide, so 75 feet. So you've got 450, you multiply that by 75 feet, you're at about 34,000 square feet. Now, if you're thinking about your house, you're probably thinking that's pretty big. And it is, multiple houses, right? 34,000 square feet. Maybe the average house is 2,000, 2,500 square feet. Some bigger, some smaller. But, you do the math there, and that's what it comes out to. But did you know, and as we look, let's see if this is still up. If we look at a picture of the world, Guam does not even appear on a map until you zoom in. So this is the default view of Google Maps. And what you find is that you can't even find Guam on this map until you actually zoom into the image. And yet Guam is 210 square miles big. Is that how you say that? 210 square miles in size. Miles, not feet, right? And so if you want to do some more math, and I did, and it was hard to find a calculator that had enough numbers to do it, how many square feet are there in 1 square mile? There are 27,878,400 feet in 1 square mile. Now, Guam is 210 square miles, and so you do that math, and it comes out to this giant number. It's almost 6 billion square feet on the island of Guam. Now, you divide that by the size of the ark, 34,000. How big is the ark in comparison with an island that doesn't even show up on a map in the middle of the ocean when you're not zoomed in? It takes 173,466 arks to cover the same square footage as Guam. You need 174,000 arks to cover that same area if you put it on a map, and it doesn't even appear on that map anywhere. And to put that in perspective, the earth is 209 million square miles in size. So to us, the ark is the largest wood frame structure on the earth. And if you've ever seen it, you're not going to forget it. But to God, it could be an easily forgotten piece of driftwood out on an endless ocean. But Genesis chapter 8 opens up with, "But God remembered Noah." How tiny that thing was, and yet he remembered it. And then he turns his attention in chapter 7 from his judgment and from his wrath, and he turns it on to Noah. And sometimes, when we put that in perspective, it changes the way that we look at the ark. It changes the way that that we would perceive the ark if we sat in the perspective of God. It's not a great and mighty thing. And I think a lot of times we have a tendency to forget things that are not great and mighty. It's the small things in my house that I've lost as I've tried to pack up everything because they're hard to keep track of and I don't remember where I put them. And yet God remembers exactly where he has put the ark. And sometimes we think that God has forgotten where he has put us, that God is not going to remember us, and that we are too small in our strength, or our deeds are too insignificant for him to take a notice, or that my talents are too few for him to accomplish something great through me. And I think this illustration of the ark shows us that that is wrong. God will remember us, and he has not forgotten us. We think sometimes that our churches are too small. Our strength is too small to stand up against the culture that we are now faced with. Its resources are too small. Its talents are too few to face the combatant world. And if that's our attitude, the ark should show us that that is incorrect, that we're wrong about that. God has no problem remembering his 8 saved souls. I imagine your church, especially if this is your church, is more than 8 people. And yet God remembers 8 people adrift in the middle of an ocean, 200 million square miles in size when they are a tiny speck on that map. God had no problem remembering them and their tiny boat churning on the sea, and yet we think that God has forgotten about us, and we have signs out front of our building, and we have our names on the doormats of our houses. Psalm chapter 147, verse 7 says that God knows and calls every star by name. I've heard umpteen estimations of how many stars exist in the universe. And it's, I think it's a wild number, but it's huge, right? I'm not sure scientists really have any idea as what that number is, but it's in the multi-billions, right? Hundreds of billions of stars. And it says here that God knows and can call every single one of those stars by name. There are only 7 billion humans on the earth. God's not going to forget you. God's not going to forget your church. You are not too small for him to take notice. And that's really the story of the entire Bible. That story runs all throughout the Bible, and it's been talked about, I know, in several sermons here somewhat recently, is that God does not need something great to accomplish something great. He doesn't need someone or something great to bring about a tremendous end for his glory. He saved the world with just 8 people. And how many times does God in the scriptures save the world or save his people through individuals who are seemingly insignificant and not thought to be powerful by many in the world? Moses had no self-confidence, and yet God uses him to accomplish great things. Jeremiah is young when he's called by God and goes to a nation that is in rebellion against God and accomplishes great things. Gideon also doesn't have any self-confidence and goes with 300 men to destroy the armies of thousands of the Midianites. David is the youngest of all of his brothers. No one thought he would be anything great, and yet he's the greatest king probably in Israel's history. All of the apostles pretty much came from nowhere, and yet were part of the rollout of the church that Jesus established. And Jesus himself, born into a manger of no significance, into a family that the world would not have thought of being significant at all, grew up in a town that had a bad reputation, and yet God was able to accomplish all that he did through Christ to bring about the redemption of the entire world and to pay the price for our sins. God doesn't need someone or some church that is great. What God needs and God wants to accomplish his mission is a vessel. And in our story in Noah, it's convenient that what God uses is exactly that, a vessel, right? The ark is a vessel, and we refer to ships that way. And in addition to that, in our day and time, what God needs is a vessel to carry a treasure to the world. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7. But we, speaking of us humans, have this treasure, the treasure of the gospel, the good news of the redemption. We have this treasure in earthen vessels, in clay jars, I think the ESV says. That the excellency of the power may be of God and not of us. So that God gets the glory, we don't get the glory. God doesn't require the Pharaoh when he can work just as well through the Joseph. Second application. This is only a 2-point sermon. This is not right. God didn't forget his promises when he was angry. God didn't forget his promises when he was angry. And I think, we as human nature, at least for myself, have a tendency to do that, to forget the promises or to decide not to follow through with the commitments and the obligations that we committed ourselves to previously because there's been some change of events, right? I have in my past admittedly made commitments and then something changes, right? Somehow or another, things don't work out the way that I thought they would, and I said, well, I don't have to fulfill that commitment any longer now that my perspective is different, or now that somebody has done me wrong, I'm not going to fulfill my promises. Some unforeseen event causes us to void our commitments. And yet the good news about God is that nothing is unforeseen to God. And so this event, or God's anger that we see in chapter 7, does not void the commitments that he's made in the past because this was not unforeseen to God. And he doesn't change his mind, and he's not as fickle as we are. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 13 says, if we are faithless, if we don't follow through with our commitments, well, let me just read it rather than inject my interpretation. If we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. He cannot turn against the word that he has given to us before. God's anger against sin does not void the promise of our redemption. And what we find as we move from chapter 7 into chapter 8 is that there are promises that God has made in the past that he will not break as we move into chapter 8. And there are promises that were made to Noah that he was going to survive the flood. And there were promises that were made even before Noah back to people like Adam and Eve. We know the promise of Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, that the seed of the woman is going to crush the head of the serpent in the end. That is how it's going to take place, and that is a commitment that God is going to keep. He's given his word, and we'll see that as we move on here into this second point. Why do you think that God chose such a volatile way to refine the world? We know that God can do things with less turmoil, or with less I don't know the word, but with less headache. No, that's not the right word. With less turmoil, we'll stick with that. God can do things more cleanly, right, than this. Why does he have to give Noah this mission of building this ark? And it's going to take him years and years and hard work and hard labor, and then he's going to destroy the world and all of the wicked through water and a flood that's going to last a number of days, a number of weeks, right? Of months. Why does he do it that way when he could have, and we know that in the past, or rather in the future in this case, he would send an angel to kill 185,000 Assyrians, very targeted, to get rid of the people that he wanted and preserve the people that he didn't want. Why the flood and the ark? Why put Noah through everything that he had to go through in order to purge out the wicked and to refine the world? The waves, the rain, the massive destruction. And you can imagine Noah on that ark and what it must have been like to feel that ship moving. I'm not a huge fan of being on ships. I don't get too seasick, but I'm not in love with that waving motion. So here he is in that ship, and you can imagine this thing is just drifting on the ocean, and what he must have felt when all of that was going on. So the ship is moving, the sounds, the things that he must have heard when the waves are battering the sides of that gopher wood must have been incredible. Do you think Noah was ever, put yourself into that boat and into his perspective? Do you think Noah was ever afraid of the wind and the waves that surrounded him? I don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us. I'm sure Satan was attempting to get him to question God, but the Bible doesn't tell us. And, I suspect that maybe Noah knew, or at least he should have known, that the ark had been commissioned by God for his purposes and was protected by his promises to fulfill his intended design. Remember that it was protected by the promises of God to fulfill his purposes. That will become relevant as we close out the sermon and look at some application for ourselves. Right? God commissioned this thing. He told him how to build it. He gave him all the ingredients or the instructions for the recipe of how to create this ark. Certainly Noah must have known God is not going to let this thing sink to the bottom of the ocean. And he's promised me that he won't. He's promised me that I and my family are going to be saved if I am obedient to him. You think Satan would have liked to sink that boat? Unquestionably, right? Of course he would have. Why? That would have completed his mission, barring any miraculous action on behalf of God, right? So what is on this boat at this given moment is the promised line, right? The woman who's going to bear the seed, if there's no women left on the earth, that promise can't happen. And so the promised seed, that promise is aboard this ark, and Satan would have loved to sink that ark in order to ruin God's plan and to make God a liar. And so here's a secret that everybody already knows. there is no possible way that ark was going to sink. There's no possible way the ark was going to sink. But what I think we fail to realize a lot of times is why. Why wasn't going to sink? And there's two reasons the ark was never going to sink. Number one is because there were promises from God that were suspended over that ark that were going to keep it afloat. Promises fixed in eternity, promises made to Noah, promises made to Adam and Eve, promises made to the world about the promised seed. And what was at stake here was the Word of God. And when the Word of God is at stake, God is always faithful. Reason number two. So number one is that there were promises suspended over that ark that could not sink. And number two was that the ark was not going to sink because God was in control of the storm. Look at Genesis chapter 8, verses, some of this James just read for us. Let's just start in verse 1. He says, "But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind to blow over the earth, and the waters subsided, and the fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were closed, and the rain from the heavens was restrained." So it's God who turned on the faucet, and it is now God who turns off the faucet. And so the reason, number two, this thing wasn't going to sink is because God is ultimately in control of that storm. And there wasn't any way that boat was sinking, because for 40 days and for 40 nights, God knew every single wave that would hit the side of that boat. And God poured out the rain where he wanted it, in what quantities he wanted it, and how steady or heavy or light he wanted it to be. And God sent the winds in the direction and in the speed that he wanted it to go. And God knew every variable that went into creating any wave on any square inch of the earth at any given time during that flood. And there was not even one wave that broke the boundary which God put in place for how high it was allowed to go. Proverbs says in Proverbs chapter 8, it's a personification of wisdom speaking, and he says, I was with God when he set the boundaries of the sea. He says the waves go this far, the water comes this far, and it doesn't come any further. God set that boundary, and the ark is no exception. There was no wave that even 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter could break the boundary for which God set it. This boat was not going to sink. So we come back to the question, why does God choose to do it this way? God takes this tiny little boat, he sets it out into this massive body of water, and he lets the storm rage all around it. Why does he do that? Well, in Noah's case, it was for the refining of God's people and for the world, to separate them from an evil world and to use them for his purposes. Now turn to Mark chapter 4. You probably have already connected this parallel in your mind, but in Mark chapter 4, go to verse 35. And on that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filled. But he was in the stern, asleep on a cushion, and they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him?" Who takes them into that storm? If you look at the very first verse that we read, Jesus says, "Let us go across to the other side." Jesus knew that storm was coming. There's no question. He doesn't have an issue with checking the weather. He knows that storm is coming, and he says to his apostles, "Let's get into this boat and let's go across to the other side." And you see here that they get into this storm, and what do they see? It says that they see the waves, and they hear the wind, and they're afraid. And there was doubt that crept into their mind. And do you think that Satan would have loved to sink that boat? Of course. Why? The seed of the woman is on that boat. Jesus, the fulfillment of everything, is on that boat. Satan sinks that boat. He wins the eternal war, barring any other interference from God. He makes God a liar, and he would ruin God's plan. And the secret is that there is no chance in a million that that boat sinks. And there are two reasons, and they're the exact same as what we already talked about. Number one is because there are promises that are suspended over that boat that it cannot sink. The seed of the woman is on that boat. Number two, God controls the storm. And Jesus could calculate every variable that went into every wave. He knew the way that the wind blew, and he knew all of that while he was asleep. And he's got all of that calculated, and he knows everything that's going on, and he knows that boat isn't going to sink, and he gets up and he tells the wind to stop. He can turn the faucet on, he can turn the faucet off. This boat is not sinking. So we come back to this question, why? Why does Jesus choose to do it this way? Why doesn't he just walk around the storm and avoid this whole situation? They probably would have taken longer, but wouldn't have got in this trouble. So why? Jesus takes this tiny little boat, he sets it into this massive body of water, and he lets the storm rage around it. Similar reason to what is going on in the story of Noah. I think for the refining of his people, for the completion of his purpose. You know, the apostles at the end of this, it says in verse 41, and they were filled with great fear and said to one another, who then is this that even the winds and the sea obey him? They have a higher view of Jesus because of this event, and they now have a faith-strengthening event that they've had to go through, and now realize that Jesus should be trusted at all times in order to accomplish what he's trying to accomplish. Now, application, and then we'll close. Could be that you are in the storm, and that could be any event, any doubt, any turmoil that's come on your life, any difficulty that's come on your life. Maybe you're moving to another country in the morning and you have to preach this to yourself to be confident of what you're doing. It could be anything. And you hear that wind blowing, and you hear those waves beating upon the side of your boat, and you begin perhaps to doubt. Maybe God has forgotten about me, and maybe I'm going to go down with this ship. Do you think Satan would love to sink your boat? Of course he would. Of course he would. To get you to doubt God, to get you to come off. The only way, to get you to go down to that ship, your faith to sink, to give up on God who sustains that boat. He would love to sink that ship, to do some damage to the eternal desire of God. And the secret is the same as it's been with all of the other ships, and that is that there is no possible way that ship sinks if you stay on that ship. There's no possible way. And there are two reasons why that ship doesn't go down. Number one is that there are promises of God that are suspended over that boat. You look at Romans chapter 8. We won't turn there for the sake of time, but Romans chapter 8. No, we will, because we have to see two words. Romans chapter 8. You probably already know what verse we're going to. Verse 28. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. Right? We have a promise from God that all things work together for good for those who are working to accomplish the purpose of God. And everything works out for good so that the purpose of God can ultimately be completed. This mission has been commissioned by God, and it is protected by his promises to fulfill his purposes. This boat is suspended by the promises of God. And number 2 is that God controls the storms that rage around us. Turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13. We read this verse all the time and we quote it all the time. And it's very important for this application, because the waves that hit your boat are controlled by the one who controls the storm and who determines how high those waves get. The troubles that come onto your life are only so high as God allows them to be, and they go no further. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13 says, "No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man, but God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape that you may be able to bear it." Those waves don't get any higher than the sides of the ship that is protected by the promises of God. The only way that ship goes down is if you get out of the ship. So I implore you to stay in the ship, and it will not sink. One last verse and then we'll close. Turn over to Matthew chapter 10. Nobody likes the long-winded preacher. I apologize. Matthew chapter 10, Jesus is sending out his apostles on the limited commission. They're only going out to the Jews to preach. And he tells them in verse 16, "Behold, I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Beware of men," he says in the beginning of verse 17. They're going out into danger. But what he's going to tell them in verse 26 is important. "So have no fear of them." Don't be afraid of these men. Verse 28, "And do not fear those who can kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell." There ought to be a fear, I think, as there was with the apostles, a respect for the God who could calm the storm. There was a fear there, and he says, don't fear men who can destroy the body. Fear the God who can destroy body and soul. But there's an important point about that God that comes in verse 29, and that is that this God is on your side, protecting you for his purposes. "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? And not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father? But even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not, therefore, you are of more value than many sparrows." God says here, I know when the sparrows fall to the ground. I know how many hairs are on top of your head, which by implication means that he knows every hair that falls off of your head. So we looked at that first application, that nothing is too small to escape the notice of God. And we looked at the ark, and we dwarfed the ark in comparison to some other things. But now, think about this application. A bird doesn't fall to the ground. A hair off your head does not fall to the ground that God cannot locate, that God cannot identify, that God cannot use for his purposes. Because it is all those things that fall into the ground and get mixed up in the soil and give it nutrients. And from those, the plants grow. And from those, the sun beats on those and they create oxygen. And it's partially that oxygen that goes into H2O, and the rain falls down on the ground. And it's in the rain, and as many of you may have saw driving home from worship this morning, it's in the rain that the rainbow is displayed, and the rainbow is the sign of the faithfulness of God. The hairs of your head, the birds of the air, all work together to put on display God's faithfulness. He has not forgotten you. You are not too small for him to take notice of. And if you are in the boat with him, the promises that are suspended over you will preserve you. Your ship will not go down. And what was that second application? God is in control of the storm. And those waves don't hit any higher than he tells them that they can go. That was a breakdown at the end. So that's the invitation. If you're not on that boat, you need to be on that boat. Outside of that boat, it's a flood. Outside of that boat, there's a flood of the judgment of God. And there's so many parallels between the church and the ark. And the one door by which we gain access to that, or that Noah gained access to his ark, there's one door in which we gain access to the church. Jesus says, I am that door. And so if you've heard the word, and you believe that it's true, and you're willing to repent of your sins and confess the name of Christ, that he's the only way, that he's going to keep you safe, that you need to be with him, and then you're willing to be baptized into him, like he died and was buried and resurrected to new life. So we die to our old selves, and we are buried and we are resurrected to new life. And then once we have those promises suspended over us, we can have confidence that if we remain in those promises, that we are never going to sink. That is the invitation. If you have need to get on the boat this evening, please do so as we stand and sing.